Mr. Ford, you made a picture called Three Bad Men, which was a large-scale Western, and you had a quite elaborate land rush in it.
Mm-hmm.
How did you shoot that?
With a camera.
Admiral John Ford. The man, the myth, the legend. The only winner of 4 Oscar statues for Best Director, including 3 of the first 15. And a man so stubborn that he had to wear an eye patch, as after a corrective eye surgery, he impatiently ripped off the bandages and became blind in one eye. John Ford made more than 130 films across 50 plus years, including a documentary where he literally filmed the Battle of Midway in World War II. As Orson Welles once famously said, I prefer the old masters of Hollywood, by which I mean John Ford, and John Ford. But of course, you've probably heard all of that before. If you know anything about the old masters of Hollywood's golden years, John Ford is a name forever etched in your memory. So in today's video, I aim not to rehash just what's been said before, but also give even the most devoted Ford aficionados new facts to sit on, and welcome the rest of you to a career as vast as the Monument Valley itself. I'll cover all 137 films Ford directed, including those lost to time. We'll look at Ford's upbringing as well as his legacy. We'll discuss the facts and rumors circulating about this legendary man, and at the end of everything, we'll answer one key question. Was this man the greatest American poet to ever live? John Ford's father and mother arrived in Boston and Portland respectively in early 1872. They married in 1875, 5 years before they shedded their Irish citizenship and became American citizens on September 11, 1880. John was the couple's 10th child. Born as John Feeney, he later changed his surname to Ford, anglicizing it to appear more professional. He was probably born in 1894, but in typical Ford fashion, he'd sometimes say he was born in 95, and as such, his gravestone actually says the wrong date. His brother Francis was a prominent filmmaker himself, and gave John many early jobs on set. But more on Francis later. Whilst growing up in Maine, John attended Portland High School and played fullback and defensive tackle on the high school football team. He was given the nickname Bull because of the way he lowered his helmet and charged the line. A Portland pub is now named Bull Feeney's in his honor. Maine couldn't contain Ford, however, and in 1914, John headed west to California where his brother was waiting, but not with open arms. Upon arrival, the young Ford immediately began working on his brother Francis's sets. An entire video could be made on Francis, discussing how he only ended up in Hollywood because he had been kicked out of the Spanish-American War, or how he founded a short-lived production company called Ford Art Films in 1917, which can't even be found on Google. Or, most notably, how he hated his brother John, even writing a memoir called Up and Down the Ladder, which attacked his brother's generation of filmmakers for the way they shunned aside supposed old-timers like him. If you recall, Francis was only 12 years older than John. But as we look at John, all we need to know is that Francis had been working in Hollywood for at least 15 years already, and he brought his brother John on dozens of sets, initially as an extra, stuntman, or production assistant, but eventually as his chief assistant and cameraman. As an extra, but not for Francis, John Ford even played an uncredited Klansman in D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation. I scoured the film and believed this to be him. Eventually, Francis's footsteps faded as his Hollywood profile declined, and it was the young, eager John who was finally given his big break as a director. And here's where the story gets good. From 1917 to 1928, the young Ford made more than 60 silent films. To this day, however, only 10 survive. Old silent films are occasionally rediscovered though, and for that reason I'm holding out hope that more will resurface, like 1927's Upstream, which was found in 2009 and holds the rare distinction of being a movie which was best left lost. I'm kidding. It's just that Ford should have left theater dramas to Berg. There are some disagreements on the first film Ford directed, but most people agree that the 1917 two-reeler The Tornado was Ford's debut. Sadly, this film is currently lost, and I was unable to watch it for this retrospective. He followed up The Tornado with a string of quickies. The Trail of Hate and The Scrapper are also lost, and Peter Bogdanovich is among the list of prominent figures who doesn't even give John credit for the former, giving credit to his older brother Francis instead. And although the next film, 1917's The Soul Herder, is also lost, we know this film to be the first of a notable pairing of Ford and actor Harry Carey, who would go on to be in 25 John Ford films. His son, Harry Carey Jr., would be in over 90 westerns as well, including many by Ford. I want to take a brief intermission before concluding our look at the silent era and talk about John Ford and the Carey family. It's definitely another subject which could and should get its own video, as there's a lot to unpack and even more conclusions to draw, but I'll try to keep things brief. Ford and Carey met at Universal in 1916, instantly connecting. Though Ford was only 21, Carey requested to Universal heads that Ford could direct the next picture that Carey starred in. They agreed. The duo made 16 one-reelers together, with Ford saying of his time that Carey tutored me in those early years, sort of brought me along. In fact, Carey often would help the young Ford direct these early shorts. It was at about this time that Carey met his future wife, Olive Golden. They were married within a year, and the newlyweds actually shared a room with Ford, allowing the men's friendship and working relationship to blossom. Eventually, the Careys moved to a ranch in Newhall, California, which was the setting straight out of a Ford picture. According to Olive, many ideas for John Ford movies were dreamed up around the wood stove in that home's kitchen. As Olive was giving birth to Harry Carey Jr. in 1921, Ford and Carey Sr. got drunk off whiskey together. Truly, Ford formed Jr. at every step of the way. Harry Carey Sr. was a tough guy too, with rugged, dark looks and deep contrast to his son's more innocent features. But he projected deep emotion which Ford was so brilliantly able to tap into. Though only 2 Carey Ford films survive in full to this day, they're a wonderful display of even a young Ford's directing ability, and a great actor at the height of his abilities. In 1922 though, Carey and Ford had a falling out that mostly ended their working relationship. The origin of this fight has been lost to time. Carey Jr. said his father refused to talk about it, but would allude to Ford's less admirable qualities. However, seeing as they did continue an unprofessional friendship, it could have had something to do with pay and equity, of which Ford was notoriously ruthless. Carey's star mostly faded from there, although he would have a few notable roles in the remainder of his life. Trader Horn, MGM's first on-location film, saw Carey in the leading role. The production of Trader Horn is notorious for many things, including the near death of star Edwina Booth from malaria. Yet, of course, Carey's finest role was undoubtedly the one he won an Oscar for, the Senate President in Frank Capra's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. As longtime friend George Hively said, Carey Sr. was a warm man. Remember the character he portrayed in Mr. Smith? That was Harry Carey. Meanwhile, Ford was not an encouraging influence on anyone, least of all redhead Harry Carey Jr. Jr.'s first film was the magnificent western Red River by Howard Hawks, but his most notable roles would be in Ford films. He was in what came to be known as the John Ford stock company of actors. Building up the loyalty of that troupe was perhaps Ford's most masterful stroke. He offered allegiance to no studios, and worked again and again with the same cast and crew wherever he went. It allowed him to be as prolific and independent as possible, and if it weren't for the stock company, there's no doubt that Ford would have been a less notable filmmaker. Harry Carey Jr. was one member of the stock company, but that was not by Ford's choice. As the story goes, Carey Sr. was dying of lung cancer in 1947, and old friend Ford, and John Wayne, another dear friend of Carey's, came to be by his side. Sr. said to Ford, "You will hire my boy. Not till after I croak, but then you will. You can bet on it." Sure enough, in 1948, Harry Carey Jr. was offered a leading role in Three Godfathers, one of my all-time favorite John Ford pictures. A stirring film, and one quite appropriate as the passing of the baton from Carey father to son. Jr. was a very different actor from his father, often playing boyish supporting roles. His best performance was probably in She Wore a Yellow Ribbon, but the most interesting anecdote involving the Carey family comes from the production of The Searchers. Considered by many to be John Ford's masterpiece, The Searchers actually involved the entire Carey family in its production. Carey Jr. plays Brad Jorgensen, a young man full of hate for the Comanches who murdered his sweetheart. His mother is played by real-life mother Olive Carey, who mostly acted in television roles around this time, but is magnificently supporting in The Searchers. And as for Carey Sr., he made an appearance through the help of an old friend. At the very end of the film, after John Wayne brings his lost niece to the loving Jorgensen family, he was filled with emotion looking at Olive and his late friend's family. In the famous closing shot of the film, as Wayne is framed by a dark doorway, he reaches his left arm across his chest and holds his right arm above the elbow, as Carey Sr. was known to do. Paying a poignant tribute to his friend, Wayne turns and slowly walks away. It's an incredibly powerful ending, even in the context of the film, but even more so when you consider the story behind the shot and who he's facing as he turns. As filming wrapped on Three Godfathers, Carey Jr. was walking around the set when he saw something surprising. His father's old horse, Sonny, and a man dressed like his dad riding on it. Ford approached the young Carey and said with uncharacteristic sympathy, "Go home, kid. You're not supposed to see this." This was the filming of a tribute to Carey Sr., which plays after the opening credits of Three Godfathers. As touching a tribute as any put to film, it was only fitting that Harry could be present in his son's first collaboration with John Ford. The torch had been passed. The status on Ford's 60-plus silent films are as follows. Straight Shooting, Ford's first feature, survives. The Secret Man, 2 of 5 reels survive. Bucking Broadway survives. The Scarlet Drop, 30 minutes survive. By Indian Post, the film survives in an incomplete form. Same with The Last Outlaw. A Gunfighting Gentleman, 3 reels survive. Just Pals survives in full. The Village Blacksmith, only 1 reel survives. North of Hudson Bay, 40 minutes survive. Cameo Kirby survives. The Iron Horse survives and is considered by some to be Ford's first masterpiece. Lightning survives. Kentucky Pride survives. The Shamrock Handicap, a print survives, but it's only at the Museum of Modern Arts. Three Bad Men survives. The Blue Eagle is almost complete with only 1 reel missing. Upstream survives. Mother McCree, 4 reels survive. And Hangman's House survives. Everything else is lost. That's it. Just 10 surviving films in full and 8 more in partial out of 60 plus movies. You can't even watch some of the surviving films unless you travel to museums across the country. And so for the purposes of this video, I was only able to watch Straight Shooting, Bucking Broadway by Indian Post, Marked Men, Just Pals, The Village Blacksmith, North of Hudson Bay, Cameo Kirby, The Iron Horse, Kentucky Pride, The Shamrock Handicap, Three Bad Men, The Blue Eagle, Upstream, Mother McCree, 4 Sons, Hangman's House, and Riley the Cop. Seeing as most of these films are impartial or insubstantial, I won't waste time talking about all of them, but I urge you to check out my Letterboxd and a YouTube short, where I plan to post a ranking of over 80 Ford films which I watched for this mammoth retrospective. Additionally, I'll briefly say here that you should watch Straight Shooting and Bucking Broadway, as they're some of the better silent westerns ever made, whereas Three Bad Men is just incredible and a celebration of the frontier unlike anything that Ford would make for a long time. Just Pals is certainly memorable. It feels like Chaplin's The Kid, but with trains and a bank robbery. The Iron Horse is long but epic, and I personally think it's better than any of Griffith's similar works. Also, your mileage may vary, but I liked Mother McCree, North of Hudson Bay, and 4 Sons too. Overall, Ford's silent era was best characterized by his ability to work fast and yell loud on set. In essence, he was becoming a director before he'd become an auteur. And if we look just at the pre-1929 Ford, he's perhaps relegated to just a footnote in film history. Yet, he's not a footnote in history. John Ford is the history, and we still have a long way to go. Though today we primarily look at Ford as a great titan of the Western genre, his time at Fox in the early talkie era from 1928 to 1938 was marked by not a single Western. We'll dive deeper into how he exploded on the Western genre in 1939, but for now, let's look at the decade preceding it. Napoleon's Barber was first released in 1928. It was not only Ford's first talkie, but the first talkie ever released by 20th Century Fox. Yet again, it's a lost film, but we're almost at the point in Ford's career where that phrase will never be uttered again. Napoleon's Barber is an important film in the history of cinema, and hopefully one that will one day be discovered as a cornerstone not only of Ford's career, but also of the history of 20th Century Fox. In November of 28, Ford released Riley the Cop, which was a standard Irish comedy, by which I mean that perhaps I just couldn't understand the humor, but it wasn't very funny. In 1929, he made Strong Boy, which is notable because it's the final lost film, and it's not even incredibly lost. In 2010, a trailer for the film was discovered in New Zealand, and while I couldn't watch the trailer myself, I was able to read old reviews of the film that makes it seem like we aren't missing much. Ford didn't truly stick to a genre the way he did westerns from 1939 onwards, and perhaps no film better proves that than 1929's adventure epic film, The Black Watch. Based on the incredible 1916 British novel King of the Khyber Rifles, The Black Watch follows a captain in the British Army who is assigned to a secret mission in India just as his company is called to France at the outbreak of World War I. As he leaves them for his covert mission, he's deemed a coward by his band of brothers. The film once again featured a young John Wayne. He was an extra in the film and worked in the arts and costume department. It is a great film and kicked off Ford's first golden age as a filmmaker. Critically, commercially, and productively, Ford was a titan of the time. He made 2 or 3 films every single year from 1929 to 1942, and if not for World War II, he might have kept that pace up longer. In addition to Strong Boy and The Black Watch, 1929 gave us Salute, a drama and sports film detailing the football rivalry between America's Army and Navy. Ford's 3 films of 1930 were Men Without Women, Born Reckless, and Up the River. It cannot be understated how incredible 1930 was for Ford, and really how incredible the decade would be. Men Without Women was a decent pre-code drama, Born Reckless was a pretty bad but still enjoyable gangster picture, and Up the River was, believe it or not, a comedy that was the feature film debut for both Spencer Tracy and Humphrey Bogart. So in just 3 years, Ford discovered 3 of Hollywood's biggest names. But then Ford managed to top himself. In 1931, his films were The Seas Beneath, a decent submarine picture marred by a terrible leading lady performance. When interviewed by Peter Bogdanovich, Ford had to say, "We had a scene, I remember, in which the German submarine slips up alongside another submarine to refuel, and this girl comes out onto the bridge chewing gum, right in the camera. So we had to go to all the trouble of doing it all over again. She just couldn't act." He also did The Brat and Aerosmith, the latter marking Ford's first Academy Awards recognition, with 4 nominations, including Best Picture. Aerosmith is easily the best of the 3, but I prefer The Brat to Up the River, and Seas Beneath is worth watching if only because Ford hated making it so much. It's worth repeating, the pace and consistency of Ford's 1930s output was simply remarkable. In fact, Fox was so impressed with the young director's efficiency and ability to craft both artful and commercial films that they raised his salary by over $100,000 per annum every year from 1934 through to the Second World War. In 1938, Ford earned $220,000, $4.7 million in today's numbers, which was more than double the salary of President Roosevelt. Talk about prestige. But the legend of John Ford would only grow from there. Now, there's a great DVD box set out there called Ford at Fox. I didn't purchase it because it retailed for $300, but it's a really well put together set which includes most of the films I'm about to talk about in supposedly the best non-Criterion restorations out there. But what I'm more interested in is just the title of that set, Ford at Fox. Up to now, he directed the silent films and the 9 talkies that we've talked about, and they are indeed worth watching. But really, they're just mere stepping stones for the director that Ford would become. And after Aerosmith was so widely hailed by the Academy, but before Ford would truly become the legend of Monument Valley beginning in 1939, Ford made a string of 17 hits from 1933 to 1938, over half under the Fox name. I mean, you see, this was truly the era where Ford found his footing, and his 6 years preceding Stagecoach will be the stuff of legends. So even though not all of these films were made at Fox, the salary and the freedom he was given by the studio in the 30s really allowed him to become the legend he became by 1939. We'll talk about all of the films he made now, but but I'll indicate with text the 8 which weren't by Fox. Still, hopefully you'll have no issue with the titling of this chapter, for if not for Fox, we have no Ford. There are so many masterpieces from this era that it's hard to know where to begin, but I have a personal soft spot for the excellent Will Rogers trilogy, as in the 3 films Rogers managed to make with Ford before his untimely death in 1935. Dr. Bull, Judge Priest, and Steamboat Round the Bend. Literally 3 of Ford's finest, most charming films, filled with a sense of community we'll see so clearly on display in How Green Was My Valley. The best of these 3 is probably Steamboat Round the Bend, which is about a con man from Louisiana entering into a steamboat race. On one hand, it's Fast and Furious but for steamboats, but on the other hand, it's an excellent, compassionate, and slightly racist meditation on the American South and its tendency to erect myths out of tragedy. No matter the interpretation, it is a great film. And though it's not one of my top 5 Ford hidden gems, his entire work with Will Rogers is some of his best work of the decade. It's a shame, too. The relationship would have undoubtedly continued long after Steamboat, but sadly Rogers died prematurely in a plane crash just 1 month before the release of Steamboat Round the Bend. It's said that just before his plane took off, Ford invited him to cruise to Hawaii with him instead. "You keep your duck and go in the water," said Rogers. "I'll take my eagle and fly." Mary Ford said that those final words would haunt John for years. He went all to pieces. He was superstitious, and those last words of Will's kept going through his ears. "You keep your duck and go in the water." Certainly, if Rogers had lived longer, then Ford's career would have had a very different trajectory. We might have seen dozens of the happy, reflective, rural comedy dramas a la Bull, Priest, and Steamboat. But as Ford instead went on to westerns, he didn't forget his roots with Rogers. When he was asked years later what men of the West were really like, he'd say simply, they were like Will Rogers. The other string of hits included Submarine Patrol, well received then, but really just a watered down version of the better submarine picture Men Without Women. Still a good watch for the action and tight direction, but inferior to Ford's other sea epic, The Hurricane. The Hurricane follows a Polynesian sailor who's been wrongly imprisoned on his perilous journey to return home. It's the kind of film which you'd find so often in the post-Titanic film world. An epic action-adventure with romance and disaster elements, and a set piece, The Storm, which is so unbelievably done that it would impress even James Cameron. Truly one of my favorites of the era. My least favorite film was The Plow and the Stars, which was actually a brief detour to RKO, but you'll find that nearly all of Ford's duds from the 30s were from other studios. The Plow and the Stars is a forgettable Barbara Stanwyck melodrama, worth watching only for completists or genre fanatics. I'm also not a fan of Mary of Scotland, an equally boring RKO period drama, which stands out in Ford's filmography but in all the wrong ways. It stars Katharine Hepburn as the titular character, but even that is no saving grace. Another Edward G. Robinson gangster flick at Columbia in 1935, The Whole Town's Talking, is actually a pretty good genre bender with some fun screwball elements. And I couldn't even watch, though I'm told they're no good, Flesh at MGM or Airmail from Universal. Airmail sounds interesting, but was clearly the much lesser film when compared to 1939's Only Angels Have Wings, in which Howard Hawks does the same things Ford did at Universal, but actually tries. And then finally, there was The Lost Patrol at RKO, which is a decent film which you'll see pop up many times on TCM. Not my favorite, but a pretty tense affair that definitely has its fans. We know someone is killed in the opening scene, but the enemy is unseen, and we follow the memorable British crew, including Boris Karloff, as they deal with their survival. Certainly worth watching, and I think it would make a great pairing with The Hurricane if you're in the mood for some 30s flicks which feel undoubtedly modern. But back at Fox, there was the Shirley Temple vehicle, Wee Willie Winkie, which A, is my second favorite Shirley Temple film of all time, and B, wasn't even the best Shirley Temple film John Ford directed. We'll talk more about Fort Apache later, but Wee Willie Winkie is as good as they come. Shirley essentially joins the troops as she goes to live with her grandfather, and her naivete and morality inflicts touches of humanity into everyone she encounters. It's the tried and true message of humanity overcoming war, but told through the lens of a 9-year-old girl. Comparisons to the films of Spielberg often come up when talking about Wee Willie Winkie, but I find Ford's trademark proficiency behind the camera to be even better. Not to mention, this film may contain one of the most moving death scenes of all time. The World Moves On feels like Ford once again stretching his How Green Was My Valley legs, and it's not great, but not as bad maybe as 1938's Four Men and a Prayer, the final film from this extensive era, which is anything less than a masterpiece. It's another story where a disgraced individual tries to clear their name, but the only thing you'll take away from it is how incredible it could be that Ford would make Stagecoach, Young Mr. Lincoln, and Drums Along the Mohawk the very next year. But I've saved my top 3 films of the era for last. 1933's Pilgrimage, 1934's The Informer, and 1936's The Prisoner of Shark Island. All 3 of these films are masterpieces in my opinion, and if you walk away itching to watch any movies after finishing this video, put these 3 near the top. Pilgrimage. True fans of Ford are quite familiar with this film, almost universally regarded as one of his best, but it's still relatively unknown. Let that in today as I strongly urge you to watch this moving, exceptional film. This is a movie which relies time and time again on undercutting our expectations, and what we don't expect is what moves us. The general plot is this. An embittered mother in a small, rural town is fiercely protective and possessive of her grown son. When he falls for a farm girl, she can't bring herself to accept it, so she secretly volunteers him for the army. She'd rather he serve than marry the farmhand. What follows is a marvelous, emotional journey, which is as much Ford's typical, quiet, thoughtful approach to generational relationships as it is a moving portrayal of a vulnerable woman who will leave you shaken to the core. Along the way on this pilgrimage are Ford's usual stock company of actors, including his older brother Francis as the small town's mayor, giving the film an extra dimension for Ford fanatics. I say this with zero reservation. This is one of the best films we've discussed thus far, and an absolute must-watch. The Informer. The Informer is right away notable for being the first of Ford's 4 Academy Award wins for Best Director, a record which still hasn't been broken. But it's also notable because it was hailed upon release as the greatest film ever made. And although that reputation has mostly diminished, nowadays you might not even hear it listed among a scholar's top 5 Ford films. Any film ever recognized as the greatest ever made is at least worthy of a closer look. The Informer is a film about judgment, guilt, and greed. It follows Jip, an ox of a man played by Victor McLaglen, as he grapples at first with the decision and then with the consequences of turning in an old friend who is wrongfully wanted for a reward. Jip needs the money, and as his desperation turns to action, and then money, so too follows the blood and guilt. The theme of guilt is the true soul of The Informer. I don't want to spoil this magnificent film, but just know that what we've discussed so far is just one small layer of the hole Jip will dig himself into, and the tension grows and grows and grows until only chaos can break it. There's so much to love about this film, Ford's tout direction being a common praise, but the highlight for me comes from McLaughlin's mountainous presence. Like the best Martin Scorsese films, The Informer shows us a destructive spiral of good, evil, right, and wrong, and even draws parallels to the biblical story of Judas. Truly, The Informer is one of the greatest films ever made. Finally, 1936's The Prisoner of Shark Island. What an incredible tale to adapt. The true story of Dr. Samuel Mudd, a horribly unlucky doctor who just happened to treat a man with a broken leg who showed up at his door. That man? John Wilkes Booth. And the reason for his injury? He just assassinated President Lincoln. Unknowingly, Dr. Mudd is tried as an accomplice to the president's murder, and he is sent to the monstrous Arcadia, a prison on what's aptly called Shark Island. What follows is Mudd's quest to escape. Aided by his wife from afar and the prison guard named Buck, Mudd's treacherous escape is wrought with danger, and it's all under the watchful eye of Sergeant Rankin, who is perfectly played by John Carradine. Mudd is played by Warner Baxter, and whilst he isn't terribly well known, I have a great fondness for him and his recurring role as the Cisco Kid in a series of westerns. He won the second ever Best Actor Oscar for playing the Cisco Kid, but his best performance is far and away Dr. Mudd. Carradine too is superb, and they work so well together in Shark Island. I also have a fondness for it as a prison escape film, one of my all-time favorite subgenres. One day, maybe I'll make an entire video on prison escape films, But for now, let me stick with the recommendation of Shark Island. It isn't one of Ford's most beloved films, but it moves at a highly entertaining speed with a fascinating subject matter. The lead performances are the best the actors ever give, and Carradine nails the true evil of Sergeant Rankin, so much so that Ford would henceforth add Carradine to his stock company. We'll see a lot more of him. And at a brisk 90 minutes, the film doesn't overstay its welcome. If you're looking for a fun, breezy Ford film, look no further than Shark Island. And thus concludes Ford at Fox, a misnamed but highly in-depth look at one of the greatest decade runs from any director ever. Although, Ford still has 3 more masterpieces in the 30s, which we'll talk about soon, and an even better decade ahead. With that, we've now looked at more than 50 John Ford films, and hopefully you've already added more than a handful of them to your watch list. But the legend is still growing, and it's about to have a major spurt. We're about to enter 1939, a legendary year for the history of film, and for Ford in particular, and then to the 1940s, in which Old Pappy went to war and to the wild, wild west. But first, if you remember, at the beginning of this video I posed a question. Is John Ford the greatest American poet of all time, or was he more of a legend than an artist? Up to now, it's pretty clear where my own opinions on the question lie. I really do find him to be an unquestionably brilliant filmmaker whose early works have rivaled Wells, Coppola, or Scorsese. But as most people will be quick to tell you, a large part of what makes John Ford such a legendary figure are his actions off the screen. In other words, the personality of Ford. A man so intimidating that even John Wayne, the ultimate cowboy, would call him Coach or Pappy. There is really no end to the myths and legends which have surrounded Ford, but here are 5 of my favorite Pappy legends. Number 1. He had many on-set idiosyncrasies. For starters, every day at noon, Ford would stop whatever they were shooting to break for tea time. It was always Earl Grey. Or he had a habit of gnawing on handkerchiefs. Every morning, his wife Mary would give him a dozen fresh handkerchiefs, and they would all be chewed to shreds by the end of the day. 2. Ford was also tough as nails, and loved to throw people he disagreed with off of his sets. If ever somebody used foul language on set, especially in the presence of a woman, they'd be thrown off of the production. On one early Fox film, Ford brought an associate producer before everyone and said, "This is an associate producer. Take a good look, because you won't be seeing him on this picture again." Perhaps the best instance of a petty Ford mockery came during the filming of Rio Grande. Producer Herbert Yates came at 10 in the morning and asked Ford when he'd start shooting. Seething at the question, Ford recruited actor Alberto Marin to pretend at dinner that night to be an inept waiter who proceeded to spill and break bowls of soup on Yates and another executive. 3. Ford was also a man of sentimentality. He had a yacht which he cherished called the Eriner. It was named after the Aran Islands, where Ford's family had come from. Furthermore, he refused to drive anything but his old battered Ford Roadster. It was so dilapidated and messy that one time, Pappy couldn't get to a meeting because the studio guard refused to believe that the real John Ford would drive a car like that. 4. There are some rumors surrounding Ford's sexuality, but they're a little baseless. The only supposed proof is that Maureen O'Hara said she saw him kiss a man once, but O'Hara also had a very tumultuous relationship with Ford. He once punched her in the back of the head at a party, and ever since O'Hara's death in 2015, previously unseen love letters have been found, written by Ford to O'Hara, and presumably left unrequited. 5. Regardless, there's no denying that Ford was a softie. He hated anyone criticizing his films, and if anyone dared compare his films to his older brother Francis's, it would be the death of them. I don't really think Ford was closeted, but he was a sensitive man determined to appear tough. Perhaps because of his Irish roots, perhaps because of his rough and tumble upbringing, or perhaps because he had so many older brothers. But whatever the case may be, I think the duality is what makes him so fascinating. The duality between his tough exterior and tender feelings. On the outside, he was so stubborn that he went blind, filmed literal war, and even terrified John Wayne. But on the inside, and this is what permeates through his finest films, Ford was a lover of brotherhood and camaraderie. He built up his own tough legend to protect the softie he really was. And perhaps no story better exemplifies that than our final John Ford legend. In the midst of the Great Depression, Ford was accosted by a former actor of his who had fallen on hard times. He begged for $200 to pay for an operation his wife needed. Actor Frank Baker witnessed as Ford became enraged and launched himself upon the man. He shouted out, "How dare you come here like this? Who do you think you are?" before storming off. But later on, as the shaken actor was leaving in shambles, Baker watched as Ford's manager came and handed the man $1,000 and had Ford's chauffeur drive him home. There, an ambulance was waiting to take the man's wife to a hospital. Ford had also flown in a specialist from San Francisco at his own expense to perform the operation. Sometime later still, Ford bought a house for the couple and pensioned them for life. Simply put, Happy was always astutely aware of everything: the past, the present, and his future reputation. He was a man with strong beliefs and dueling sides to his personality, and it was the perfect mix to give his westerns the grit and heart which no other filmmaker has been able to match. Regardless of whether you consider him to be a tremendous artist, there is no denying that the legend he built around himself was perfectly primed to make him an exceptional director. Everyone was eager to impress John Ford, even producers, and yet as scary as he could be, there was a loyalty, sentimentality, and heart to the man which made people keep coming back. There has never been a director quite like Pappy. At this point, I want to break up the video. Ford's career still has most of the highs to come, and I find the post-war Ford films to be even better than the pre-war films. But at this point, I think the legend has been built up, and with the next video, I want to talk about how the legend fell. The Death of John Ford, coming out very soon, will explore the remaining 45 films the director made, which we haven't discussed yet, as well as a few surprises. Though I'm biased, I really hope you'll check it out, as it's maybe my favorite video I've ever made, and the thesis of it is all about the true politics of Ford. And finally, if you learned anything at all, or just plain liked this video, I hope you'll consider liking, subscribing, or sharing it. Here at When the Pictures Got Bigger, I aim to put out high quality videos on the history of cinema, with this John Ford video being just the beginning. If you want to see more and want to suggest future video topics, the comments are always a great place. I'm open for any feedback and discussion. After all, I'd love for this place to be a community for Ford fans and classic Hollywood fans alike. And with that, I leave you with a teaser for the Death of John Ford's thumbnail, coming out very soon. Be sure to check that one out when it releases. I put even more work into it, and I hope you'll enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed making it. Until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.